Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. As I know you all know, much of the criticism against Israel from the international community, such as it is since the outset of Israel's ground operation in Gaza, has been the alleged high casualty toll. There have also been allegations that Israel really isn't getting anywhere in its war. Hamas alleges that there are 30,000 plus Gazans who have been killed in the war, and they say that 70% of the casualties have been women and children. Over the weekend, there was an important article in Tablet Magazine that I cited earlier this week and in Focus that was written by a Wharton statistician named Abraham Weiner, and he explained that from a mathematical perspective, those casualty rates make absolutely no sense. At any rate, one of the people who was first to point out that a lot of the criticisms of Israel's war operation in Gaza are inaccurate, and they simply fail to understand both the nature of the war that Israel is fighting and also the extent to which it's going in order to prevent civilian casualties, is Professor John Spencer, who's the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And he has become quite a celebrity here in Israel based upon his analyses of the war that have been published in two different articles in Newsweek. And he was here a couple of weeks ago on the ground with IDF forces. And it's my pleasure to have Professor Spencer here on the program today to talk about his research and his assessment of Israel's war in Gaza. So first of all, welcome to you, Professor John Spencer. Thank you very much for joining me on the Caroline Glick Show today.
Well, thanks for having me. Really, it's an honor.
Well, can you start? The honor is all mine. But can you start us out and explain to us, how you even approach an assessment of Israel's operations on the ground in Gaza? What are you looking at first and foremost when you're trying to make your assessment of the success and of the level of lethality, et cetera?
Sure. So the first thing I'm looking at, one is the compare and contrast to anything that's happened before, since I've been studying this type of warfare only, urban warfare, fighting in cities, in dense urban areas. So the first thing I looked at was the challenges. So the nature of the terrain, the density of it, the construction of the buildings, the tunnel complexes, which are, just never been faced before. The fact that the enemy, Hamas, built all of its military infrastructure underneath the civilians on purpose. The rockets that are emanating from the combat areas, the hostages. So strictly from an analytical perspective is that we have to look at all the variables which are present that the IDF faced at the beginning of the war and continue to face, and then try to make a comparison to any other like situation. And this is where I think the world is really ignorant of war. One, a lot of the world just woke up to what war looks like. And two is that they continue to compare anything going on in Gaza to a counterterrorism or counterinsurgency operation. And while Hamas is a terrorist organization, it's also an army. It was a massive army of over 30,000 fighters set up in military organizations, mostly light infantry battalions of over 30 battalions. And it was controlling land. It had built defenses over 15 years. All of the comparisons really are wrong that everybody tries to make. Everything from the numbers to the destruction to the level of bombs that are dropped. All of them are comparing Gaza to some other situation that has nothing to do with a war that is more like a state-on-state war. I mean, it's a territory. It's not a state, but it's a territory with a governing power and a massive military with huge amounts of military capability. You really have to go back to World War II style battles to compare it against.
Can I ask you 1 second about those capabilities? What you're describing here really is a very powerful enemy. So can you just explain, how do you assess the strengths of Hamas?
Sure. So by the fact that they're an army is the fact that they're a completely military faction with over 30,000 units, with assigned battalions, with assigned geographic areas to defend. So in warfare, we say that defense is always the strongest form of warfare, and we do what's called combat power analysis. And if you're in the defensive positions and Hamas has had 15 plus years to build defensive positions. This all increases their combat capability. Yes, they don't have an air force. They don't have armor and tanks. They're mostly light infantry, but they're in probably the most strong defensive terrain that could ever be created. Like, they're literally bomb-proof bunkers underneath every house. I mean, there's 400 miles of tunnels that range from 15 feet to 300 feet underground where no military munition can reach. You have lots of drones and things above, but you can't see through concrete. You can't see underneath the buildings. It's immense defensive capability, but also the rocket supply. So the fact that Hamas has launched over 12,000 rockets at Israel's civilian site, every one of them a war crime, is part of their combat power. And they have continued, although the number has gone down and on some days it's zero, to launch rockets at Israel adds to what capabilities they have, as in their ability to resist the IDF, which is not their goal actually, but as a military combat power. The fact that they're sitting in these defensives waiting for attack and have been planning for that for 15 years really doesn't matter how big the Israel defense is or how powerful they are. This is the idea.
What do you mean by when you? Well, let me just interrupt for 1 second. What do you mean when you say that their goal is not to? What did you say, that their goal is not to beat the IDF, or it's not to? Yeah. It's not successfully confront the IDF forces from Gaza. What's their goal?
Yeah, their goal, and if they're successful, they win. Their goal was to invade Israel, which they did, and they had much larger goals. And I think people either aren't aware or don't understand how much larger the goals of Hamas were on October 7th. But they also wanted the counterattack. And then in the counterattack, it wasn't to, usually in military operations, you want to destroy the other military and defeat them on the field of battle. That's not what Hamas' strategy. Hamas is a political military strategy. They did the attack, they wanted the counterattack, and then they wanted to hold in the tunnels and using the hostages and just buy time for the international community, namely the United States, to stop the IDF in their operations. And then politically, they have gained immense power in the region and around the world as the people who struck at Israel and survived. Their only goal is to survive, which is very unique. It's not even to hold ground. Sometimes you might say you have a terrain-based strategy where they want to hold their cities, hold their ground. It's all about time, and they want to survive the counterattack. They want to survive Israel's attack against them, which gives them immense political power, and they get to, if they survive in any way, they have strategically won the war.
So I want to talk to you for a second then about Israel, and then we'll go back to the strategic ends here. So you go through, I think it was in your first article in Newsweek, and you started explaining how on basically every parameter, now I'm looking for my notes, Israel is abiding entirely by international law, that the concept that Israel is disproportionately attacking or causing disproportionate harm to civilians when it attacks Hamas targets is both unmeasurable and wrong. So can you just go through a couple of the parameters that you laid out in your analysis of how Israel is fighting? And then I'd like your assessment of Israel's success so far.
Yeah, I think the first part is, of course, everybody agreed that Israel had the right of self-defense and to launch the war against Hamas. They were attacked, UN Charter. You don't even have to request permission. You can just notify the United Nations on Article 51 that you can respond. And then you get into the law of proportionality, which that word has gotten basically hijacked by the world on what is proportionality. In war, in a war of self-defense, it's proportionate to remove the imminent threat to you. That's it. So on the larger scale, proportionality is, are you using the appropriate force to remove the threat? In this case, it's in Hamas, an existential threat, especially with the rockets to Israel, not just with the attack. And the goal of the war has been very clear since day one: bring the hostages home, destroy Hamas, and secure Israel's border. Proportionality in the overall war is use the force required to remove that threat, which has been daily with the rockets. The other aspect of proportionality is use the force, only target a military target. use the force appropriate to that target. And then even if it's appropriate, you assess what the collateral damage will be. And it is the military value, which get into, people still deny, and most people don't even talk about the fact that this is an existential war. Hamas tried to, not only what it did on October 7th, its goal is to destroy Israel and all the Jewish people. It's an existential threat, which gets into the calculation of proportionality of like, I am removing this existential threat. Now, in my other articles, based on both knowing the idea and being on the ground twice now in Gaza, is, even when you take in this, it's a military necessity, you're using proportional force. In my opinion, it's overwhelming force, not over any other term. It's overwhelming force, and that's what militaries do. You want to strike with overwhelming force and destroy your enemy. That doesn't mean you don't follow the laws of war, but you do. Even with that, you have to take all feasible precautions, is what it's called, to limit civilian harm. Only strike military targets, and when you're doing so, take all precautions to limit. And this is what I laid out in my article in Newsweek, is that not only has Israel done every known action to limit civilian harm, they've gone above that and now are doing things that no military has done in the history of warfare. Like the fact that, yes, if you know you're going into an urban area, you give warning that you're going, and you give civilians time to evacuate. And that's what Israel did in the north. Now, how you do that has usually been you surround the civilian area and drop flyers, and you set up evacuation lanes and zones for the civilians to go to. Well, Israel did that, just like the United States did in the Battle of Mosul and the Battle of Fallujah. But what Israel also did was, millions of phone calls, soldiers sitting on phones, calling into Gaza, into the areas they were going into, text messages, drones with speakers, airdropping speakers onto the ground, all giving days and weeks for the civilians to evacuate. And as the war progressed, Israel also gave out their military maps, which they got a little bit of credit for, but I've never seen it. They gave out their.
It was funny because when I was reading over those articles before we had this conversation, I started shaking my head and I said, how can a military that gives this kind of notification to its enemy that it's coming in, and specifically where it's coming, and telling them you should leave, how can such an operation have a chance of being successful? I mean, how do you assess that? No military has ever taken these kinds of steps to prevent harm to civilians, and nobody has ever been accused of harming civilians the way that Israel has, of course. But I mean, how can Israel win under these circumstances? How can you defeat your enemy when you're giving them this kind of notification?
Yeah, it makes it significantly more difficult. Absolutely. And again, these are the steps that were taken during major counter-insurgency and counter-terrorist operations, like the operations against ISIS. But I think this, again, where people fail. ISIS and Hamas share a lot of the vicious tactics of brutality, but they're completely different. ISIS was an insurgent force in Iraq and Syria, in which the nation of Iraq and we helped them try to expel those insurgent forces from their territory. This is a military army that you're attacking. So yeah, absolutely, it makes it harder that you signal to your enemy every step that you're making. You give your maps out to the enemy, and you tell the enemy exactly where you're going to be, all in the pursuit of limiting civilian harm. And this is what we've seen, right? We've seen Hamas, who was in northern Gaza, although many of them were destroyed, but the hostages, the Hamas senior leadership, just moved wherever the civilians were told to move to, usually through a tunnel. So absolutely, this is the kind of the question nobody wants to ask, is that, usually we don't give warning in actual wars. The United States didn't give warning in Panama, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Russia, who doesn't follow the laws of war, didn't give warning in Ukraine, in Chechnya, because you give away what's the vital thing in wars to end wars quickly is surprise and the shock and all, the overwhelming speed of your operations. If you have to stop and tell the enemy exactly where you're going to be, but that's where we're at. It's just unfortunate. Even in the maps that Israel gave out, They will
The
tell.
question is just, is that even effective then? I mean, do you have any, because you do have an assessment of Israel's success rate. That's what is also so remarkable about your analysis. Not only do you point out the, in a way, self-defeating lengths that Israel goes to in order to protect civilians, but you also then talk about how successful Israel is. So can you give a little bit of that as well?
Sure. And this is where I tried to compare. One, I told people to stop comparing Israel's operation in Gaza to counterterrorism operations. There is no comparison. Actually, even in war, if I go back to World War II, the only battle I could find that has any of the properties is the Battle of Manila, where the Japanese had held American prisoners of war and civilians for years, and MacArthur told them to go, basically do the operation to bring those hostages, prisoners of war, home. And in that operation, there were 17,000 Japanese defenders. We attacked with around 37,000 American forces. And MacArthur didn't want the city destroyed, but we killed 100,000 civilians taking that city. So in my assessment,
out of a total population of
1.1 million.
Of 1 million, right?
Yeah. So this is the problem. I know we'll talk about it, but I don't like even talking about the numbers because that's not how war works. And I don't want future wars being, well, yeah, but you have the right to conduct this war, but what's your civilian to combatant death ratio going to be? Like, that's not how war works. It's not how the laws of war work in general. Yes, war is politics, so there is a moral kind of belief of what's going on. But so from metrics of the IDF, so despite all these hurdles, and there is no comparison to even the challenges, right? So 30,000 fighters in military-grade tunnels underneath cities, who want as many civilians to die, which is unique as well, although the Japanese also wanted the Philippine people to die, so there's some similarities there. But by every metric in which you assess a military operation, so time, like how long does it take you to take away the enemy's territory or clear urban terrain? The IDF cleared northern Gaza in 2 months. It took 9 months for 100,000 Iraqi security forces backed by the greatest air power of the world, the United States and the coalition. It took them 9 months to clear one city. And the IDF have cleared 6 cities in northern Gaza in 2 months with an enemy force that nobody's faced. So by terrain and speed, by the number of enemy combatants killed, the number of battalions they've destroyed now, in 5 months, they destroyed 18 of the 24 coherent Hamas battalions. So by that metric, incredible speed. The number of IDF soldiers killed, although everyone unfortunate, is incredibly lower than anybody with any knowledge of military operations would have expected in urban warfare for the IDF to take it. The Iraqi security forces lost 10,000 soldiers in trying to take the battle, the city of Mosul away from 3,000 to 5,000 ISIS fighters. So by every metric, enemy killed, terrain taken, losses of themselves, of the IDF are really, and I don't like to continually use the historic, but their performance and effectiveness has actually been higher than any other operation with any similar traits, and as well as the civilian casualties. And this gets to the numbers, right? So how many civilian casualties have died in Gaza can't be known. It just, period. Like, I've never seen, and I study urban battles for a living, where you could have a daily running count of how many civilians have died. Just think about it. I mean, it's war. Even in the Battle of Mosul, it was a year after the war ended, and the Iraqi forces said that we don't know how many died. The
what's
numbers
so crazy is, of course, that Israel, it took us, I think, over a month to figure out the number of people who Hamas murdered on October 7th, and we're a modern state, and we have state-of-the-art first responders, and then afterwards going through and trying to identify the remains of people who had been incinerated, etc. It took us a really long time to get through the work, and here you're assessing that an enemy that is underground, that is losing control of territory, that he actually has instantaneous, credible data. And what's even more bizarre about the international communities, and particularly the U.S. government's willingness to credence these numbers, is that, in real time, they've been exposed as false in many, many incidents. I mean, I'm just thinking, first of all, about the hospital that they claimed that Hamas alleged that Israel had attacked with a missile when it was actually their own missile that had attacked there, and that there were 500 people dead, which they knew, 1 minute after the missile fell, and everybody was demanding an instant explanation and everything else. And so it's the same thing. I mean, it goes on and on and on. We see the falsity of their allegations. We see that they have no credibility, and then we see this incredible willingness on the part of people who know better, not should know better, but actually do know better, to credence the numbers as fact.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. And I can say, as a military analyst, 30,000 civilians have not died in Gaza. It's just not a fact. One, there's no way to know the number. And two, that number accounts for 0 Hamas militants. So in war, there's 2 categories. There's combatants and non-combatants. Civilians who are not partaking in the hostilities are non-combatants. The Hamas generated number from the Gaza Health Ministry includes 0 combatants killed. So it includes every Hamas fighter who has died in the war. So there's not 30,000 civilians that have died. And there's really no way to know the number. But yeah, even if it was 30,000, if you subtract the number of combatants that, if you don't believe Israel for some reason and you just want to take a terrorist's numbers, how many combatants have died versus non-combatants? But the question is, Caroline, is if that's the number, but you're saying it's too much. I've never seen a war, nor do I want a war, in which we say, yeah, I know it's an existential threat to your survival, and you have every right to fight back. And I know they still have your hostages. And I know they still are launching rockets literally 2 miles from your civilian populations, but the civilian casualties, despite you following every law of war, is too much. So you have to stop. That would change the world and would lead to a much more violent world, because this would show the world that every terrorist organization of the world would start taking hostages, embed themselves in the civilian population, and that's what Hamas did. Hamas really built a strategy to lead to this. It's like the world is falling into Hamas's trap. Hamas built all of their military infrastructure underneath civilians, under hospitals, schools, under civilian homes. And they want as many civilians to die as possible. Literally, the 2.2 million people who live in Gaza could fit in Hamas's tunnels easily. It's over 400 miles of tunnels, but there are no civilians allowed in their tunnels. And they have publicly said, I want as many of our civilians to die as martyrs as possible. We need that blood. It is really problematic as a student of war, is if this strategy of Hamas has worked, and by running with the Hamas civilian number, it's working on many fronts. And it's really dangerous, I think, for the future.
And it's actually shows that their doctrine or their war concept was correct. I mean, their concept that all we have to do is survive, because we know that dead or alive, if we survive in any way, for instance, in Rafah, then Israel loses. And all we need to do in order to survive is to wait, because after a few weeks or a couple of months, world opinion is going to change. It's going to turn on Israel. It's going to stand with us. We can depend on that happening, and we can depend ultimately on the United States then calling for Israel to stand down, saying that its operations are over the top, accepting our casualty numbers, and accusing Israel of not abiding by the laws of war, et cetera, so that by doing the sorts of things that we're seeing being done, and I'm trying to be careful because I know you work for West Point. I don't want to get you in trouble, but I mean, actually what we're seeing on the ground is that the Biden administration is living up to Hamas's expectations here.
So you're right. I won't comment on what anybody says politically, but I will say is that, having visited now twice, that despite people falling into the Hamas trap, is that the IDF have continued operations. They have continued clearing, and yes, they have had restrictions put on them that normally wouldn't be on a military. Like, you can't go into those areas, period, until you evacuate them of a very high percentage of civilian casualties. This is what I've seen now. Their maps that the IDF handed out, that every single area is color coded on how many civilians are living there, in which they use satellite imagery, cell phone presence, photos of buildings to determine what the civilian population, and they don't go into those areas until the civilians have been removed, or they definitely don't conduct operations. But despite all the rhetoric, Caroline, and despite the political aspects of this, because all war is political, is that the IDF have continued. And they've continued to figure out a way. And I was just in Khan Yunis 2 weeks ago. They figured out a way to take the tunnel advantage away from the enemy. They figured out a way to reduce civilian casualties down to, and again, I don't like using the numbers, but okay, fine, we want to use 1 to 1. They've reduced the civilian casualty to enemy combatant number to historic low numbers in a war, right? Not a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency operation. So despite so far the Hamas strategy hasn't worked, there is a possibility it could be, but it hasn't worked to stop the idea.
When you were in Khan Yunis a couple of weeks back, what were your impressions of the military forces that you saw there in terms of their professionalism, their overall performance, and their esprit de corps, et cetera? How did you assess them?
Yeah,
and I know that you've done 2 tours of duty in Iraq yourself. So
I have, and I've traveled the world into military war zones in Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, studied battles all around the world. I mean, from my time with the 98th Division in Khan Yunis, I was significantly impressed by the morale, their understanding of the challenges, and walking the ground. I had a much deeper appreciation of the challenge where every other building, it has a bomb in it, has a tunnel in it. The sheer challenge of moving through the terrain, let alone fighting an enemy there. I was really impressed by the professionalism and and again, I guess what isn't getting briefed to the world, the steps that they're doing to not just limit the civilian harm, but basically prevent it. So doing operations where they have to have such a high fidelity that there is no enemy there, or no people there. I mean, of course there's enemy there. And even trying to keep from Hamas just moving where the civilians go. And that's been such a big challenge. But really, the rhetoric doesn't match the facts on the ground of what the IDF do to prevent civilian harm, and how they take away Hamas's, the advantages they have being the defender in this dense populated urban areas.
What's interesting is that at the outset of the war, very shortly after October 7th, a lot of, I don't know who they are, but some very high-level American generals came from the Pentagon to the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, our military headquarters, and started giving advice to the IDF about how to organize the war, how to plan the ground operation, etc. And they continue to do so. That's based on their experience fighting, as you said, counterinsurgency warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. How applicable do you believe that American experience fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan is today for IDF forces in Gaza? And what are the similarities and differences?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, I've been studying just this type of warfare across, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but across the history of war, urban combat. And there are very few people, especially in the U.S. military, that doesn't have urban warfare schools. It doesn't have, it just doesn't study it. So yeah, you could say that they're relying on their experiences. There's nobody left there's one 4-star general who was left from the Second Battle of Fallujah, which is when the U.S. conducted a high-intensity fight, but not at this scale, against this type of enemy, with this type of tunnels, with hostages, with rockets. There's nobody in the U.S. military who has that experience, so that's a fact. There is just nobody who's had that experience. Yes, we were involved in advise, assist, and providing support to Iraqi security forces in the Battle of Mosul, which was the biggest urban battle since World War II, period. And there's some great information that was learned from there, but I can tell you with very strong clarity that the Iraqi security forces are not the IDF. They're just not. They're just, the way the equipment, the the ability to learn, their experiences, their technologies. It's not. But again, there is no similarity to U.S. experience unless you go back to World War II. And we had very limited experiences even in World War II. The Battle of Manila, the Battle of Aachen, really were our two biggest urban battles that the U.S. military were involved in. And very few people even remember those battles, period, let alone remember what happened at those battles. So there is no similarity, especially in the U.S. military, to this challenges that the IDF had faced, even in the political aspect. The U.S. military has, of course, been accused of war crimes, to include in assisting in operations against ISIS. The same players, air wars, and all the humanitarian groups were saying that the American forces are complicit in war crimes. Even in the Second Battle of Fallujah, there were like 80 claims of war crimes in the battle of. And this is the trend, though, of people believing there is a law of war without actually understanding there is a law of war and what it takes. So there's a saying that if anybody's ever studied urban warfare knows is that even coming out of Vietnam, which wasn't urban at all, is that it became necessary to destroy the city to save it. And that's a really euphemism to understanding that if there is a defender who refuses to leave, and I think that's the actual other similarity that's not here either, is that in many urban fights that the U.S. military or others have been in, to include the invasion of Iraq, is that if the combatant doesn't fight, it isn't as destructive. The Iraqi army didn't resist. They were destroyed in the open. They didn't defend Baghdad, barely. So that's the other where the analogies break apart, is when you can't reason with the enemy and he doesn't care how many civilians. And in the case of Hamas, he actually wants as many civilians to die. He wants every photo of every destroyed building to be aired around the world. There is some uniqueness there as well, where, again, you have to go back to really the Japanese. Even the Germans in World War II would call cities open cities and would leave cities rather than defend from them until the death. This is, again, where all the analogies and people's misunderstandings of war just really start to fall apart. And it becomes to a point where either you're that ignorant to what the challenges are and what it takes to overcome those challenges, or you're doing it intentionally. You're intentionally trying to turn information into weapons against Israel.
So that's the other thing, is that, one of the very unique aspects, I think, of this war is the proximity of the battle space. That, it's walking distance from our homes. Gaza is. It's right there. It's adjacent to Israel. It's just right here. So that we're literally fighting for our lives. We're fighting for our communities, which were overrun on October 7th, etc.
Yeah. I agree that proximity is not there, right? So the American forces have never had to fight a war like that on the border, or the rockets. I think people continue, because this is it. This is the real frustrating part. Again, understanding war. This is a war. Yes, there are lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan in the post-conflict phase. Absolutely, you can lose a much larger war the day after, right? So this is the ideal of, but there are actually definable metrics to the goals of the war against Hamas. Bring the hostages home, destroy Hamas, secure the borders. There are lessons, of course, after the destruction of Hamas from Iraq and Afghanistan, which we significantly messed up and had to learn lessons for a decade to understand how to fight counterinsurgencies. That's not this war. And I agree with you on the proximity, but what people continue to not say is of the rockets. It's like, well, Israel's the bigger power. What's the alternative to the war is stop. So just stop the war. That's what, this idea of a fact that you could do this in a different way is not true. And if you think that somebody else would do it in a different way, I can show you historically, if the U.S. military faced this problem of hundreds of our civilians, babies, children taken on our border, like let's say Mexico, rockets emanating from there within a mile from where the war is. All of these variables, yeah, we would do it differently, and it would be probably a lot more destructive, and not listening to a lot of the outside rhetoric, because we would have clearly legal, definable goals in the war. But yeah, the proximity is another question, but I think the rockets as well, because the ideal of just stop. You could do this differently. Well, what about the rockets? Well, you have the Iron Dome. Like, that's not the same question. Oh, what about the hostages? They'll negotiate. Well, that's not true either. I think the alternative, all the rhetoric, it doesn't have an alternative. The alternative is just stop. That means Hamas achieves victory. That means the hostages don't come home, and that means over 100,000 Israelis can't go back to their homes if you include the north. And I know we'll talk about the north. I think this is really dangerous territory for the future of the world, in my opinion.
Yeah. So the thing about that I want to talk about you with the civilians, it goes to the question of, we destroyed the village in order to save it, because when you're looking at the level of support that Hamas enjoys, both in Gaza and, of course, in Judea and Samaria, then the question becomes, well, how the civilians were willing to have their homes used as entry points to subterranean tunnels. They were willing to have their hospitals and schools serve as Hamas installations for whatever purpose, to have missiles shot at Israel from UNRWA clinics. They're willing participants in Hamas's war effort. And so when Israel is looking at both fighting the war today and also at the day after scenarios that are being bandied about, when you're looking at it, how do you think that Israel should be assessing this environment going forward? Because they're going to be at our doorstep tomorrow also.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, but from the execution of the war, while that is all true, in Hamas is the governance of Gaza, and Hamas is the military army of Gaza. It's more of a state-on-state analogy that should be used. In the execution of the war, despite that assistance from the civilian population, that compliance, that everything from the civilian population, in war, there's still, you have to separate combatant, non-combatant, and execute the war in that fashion. I want the laws of war followed. And this is why, my first article on CNN was, Israel is following the laws of war in going above them, period. You can debate other aspects of stopping, water going in for a day or two, the collective punishment ideal, but it's just not backed up by the evidence of the facts. I want the laws of war, because if not, the brutality of war will continue to increase. And that's why the Geneva Conventions even said, you can't target civilians. You have to take all these precautions. And that's what Israel is doing. Afterward, though, that is where it will matter on how do you move forward, and what is the new construct where you just don't have, Hamas has to be destroyed or they win, period. Yes, if depending on what you do the day after, especially with everything, Hamas was elected, and then Hamas was allowed sanctuary and got support from the people to do all these things. But how do you create an environment where just Hamas 2.0, PJI, Lions Den, or whatever just doesn't take the mantle and become the new Hamas and take another decade to do another October 7th attack? That will be assessed as well militarily on how you do that. And there's lots of lessons, yes, from Iraq, Afghanistan, counterinsurgency history, is that you have to establish new power structures. You have to do the disarmament. You have to do the re-education. You have to help with all the essential services, all that. But there's separate questions, Caroline. How do you execute the war? You have to separate combatants and non-combatants like Israel has, despite all the help. But if you're a civilian engaging in the hostilities, this again goes back to the number, you're not a civilian, you're a combatant. That's just fact. That's the way it works.
So then, the other aspect to this that's important to note is that that Hamas is a proxy. I mean, Hamas is a Sunni jihadist Muslim Brotherhood organization that is a major component, the largest political force in Palestinian life in Gaza, and also the most popular one in Judea and Samaria. But it's part of Iran's axis of proxies, and so that too is an important aspect of understanding and being able to really kind of to assess the nature of the enemy that you're fighting. Because even in some of the Hamas communications that were uncovered and exposed by the IDF during the course of the war, you saw that Sinwar said, Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, that the invasion of October 7th was coordinated and approved by Iran. So let's just pivot for a second to the ally, to the partner in Lebanon. Everybody here thinks that we can't restore any sort of modicum of security to northern Israel without a significant military operation in Lebanon.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you that there's a one theme to all instability in the Middle East, and it's Iran. All of its proxies. And this is a test of its grand strategy, to be honest. Hamas, Shia, Sunni, doesn't matter. It's proxy groups doing its will is a test of the appeasement that the world has given Iran, or if not financial support that they've given Iran to try to appease it, hasn't worked. And that October 7th not only changed Israel, it not only changed the security framework in the region, but it should have changed the world and how they deal with Iran and allowing it to continue these proxy wars on a scale that's never been done. I mean, it's just not, it's all of them. Iran is Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, the Shias of Iraq, or the paramilitaries in Iraq. And I agree with you on the north is that on October 8th, Hezbollah attacked, and I actually got to walk some of the ground in the north as well along the blue line. And I think if the world would acknowledge what Hezbollah has done, would be step one. It's not just the rockets, it's direct attacks on IDF positions along the line, violation of an actual UN Security Council resolution. I think everybody was hoping that, Iran would tell Hezbollah to back up, to stop attacking Israel, and that doesn't happen. I mean, what needs to happen is that Israel has to secure its borders. I mean, even in that region, I never hear about it in the mainstream media either, is that there's 80,000, complete cities evacuated in northern Israel, not out of precaution because they're being attacked. 80,000 people still can't go home, are living in hotels in Tel Aviv and schools all across Israel. It's actually concerning that it's not being talked about as much, how much Hezbollah is attacking. And in any other case would be a full-scale self-defensive war. And unfortunately, it's looking more and more like that military action will be required to secure Israel's borders. I mean, this is where people who don't want more war, of course, but what's the alternative? It's alarming. And like you said, the attacks are, and it's a different threat. I mean, it's not a Hamas. It's a much larger, much more capable, much more dangerous threat, which is hard to comprehend looking at October 7th, which I think people are still denying what it is by calling it a terrorist attack. It wasn't a terrorist. Yes, they were terrorists and they did terrorist things, but that was a full division level invasion of a nation, of Israel. And people want to be, basically downgrade what happened or forget about it in general. But now they're trying to just not even talk about what's happening in the north and what will be required. And there is some conversation, but I'm not saying that a full-scale ground attack is the only alternative. You would hope, and this gets into rational actor theory again, that one, you would hope that Hamas would just surrender, so give up the hostages. In this situation, you would think Hezbollah would stop attacking, back up, for their own survival, or Iran would tell them to do that, since they do take all direction from the ultimate puppet master.
When you looked on the ground in the north, but also when you were with our forces in Gaza, how much of what we're doing today in Gaza do you think will be applicable to Lebanon?
I mean, of course, it'll be a different fight, right? So dense urban combat versus a much more open, mountainous, hidden, wooded. Yeah, if you know the north, how much concealment the woods provide, it would be a completely different fight. But they're also, and Israel has now gained a lot of experience, and that's something unique to the IDF as well that I've studied for years, is that their ability to transform themselves, even with the tunnel threat, how they transform themselves from never go into a tunnel to taking the tunnels away from Hamas, which is what they've done. But there's a lot of combat experience gained in the last 6 months that has hardened and increased the performance of the IDF for sure. It'll be a different terrain. It's a different threat. It will be much larger scale if that war happened. And the urban areas. So this is my problem with Hamas, again, trying to compare them to terrorists. Even ISIS didn't want all civilians to die. Yeah, they killed a lot of civilians, but even when they seized Mosul, they increased the amount of power. Because they were ruling by force, but the water, the power, all the services actually increased during their rule, because if you didn't do it, you died. But where Hamas is, like you said, what I saw on October 7th was like, truly, they released 4,000 Jeffrey Dahmers on Israel, who have no remorse, who enjoy slaughter, who methodically killed. It wasn't incidental. And I wrote an article in Time magazine about, as a military instructor, of how much precision and planning went into slaughtering civilians. But they also have no respect for their own, if they could even have their own civilian life. And this is, again, a failure to recognize that their rationality isn't just that they want to die as martyr. They want as many of their own citizens to die, which is very unique, actually, in wars, to say that that's our strategy, is to get as many of our people killed versus killing as many of their, even if they dehumanize the Jewish people, which they have, so much so. I don't know if Hezbollah has that same mentality. Of course, they are fine dying as martyr, and Iran is fine with them dying as well. But there is a different calculation there when they will make a determination for their self-survival versus, being martyrs for Iran.
When you look overall at Israel, and I know you're going to be speaking at the APAC conference this week in Washington, what is the message that you really want to communicate as an urban warfare expert, as a professor at West Point? What is it that you try to tell your students and about what Israel experienced and is experiencing, and how they should be looking at this conflict in general?
I mean, one of the things, if I was talking to a military audience, would be to, one, recognize the metrics in the performance of the IDF. By every metric, has been incredible, but also their ability to take the advantage away from the enemy. It's actually something we teach from a theoretical down to a tactical perspective, is don't fight the way the enemy wants you to fight. Achieve the political goals you've been given in a unique way. And this is, even I have been surprised, and I teach this type of warfare, how the IDF have taken Hamas's advantages away from them, whether it was even, attacking from east to west right into the Hamas defenses, or going around Hamas defenses. And that level of warfare, right, that is, don't attack your enemy's strengths, attack their center of gravities, use speed and surprise, despite the constraints that have been put on the IDF. I mean, one of the messages I have is just recognize and acknowledge the amazing performance of the IDF despite the challenges. Acknowledge the challenges and then recognize the performance of the IDF. And like you said, they're also getting stronger every day and learning everything from Army level, the air-ground integration, the thinking through the challenge and finding a way which nobody has thought about on how to overcome those challenges. So I have a lot of messages. One, in make sure the criticism, if there is criticism, is actually backed by facts and evidence, but acknowledge the positives as well, as in the performance.
When I was in Iraq myself in 2003, I was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division, and I saw that the forces there really didn't have the right analogy when they went in. They were talking about their grandfathers having liberated Paris from the Nazis, and I said to them, "No, this isn't like that. This is the analogy is Lebanon." And, we went in there, and just like the forces in the 3rd ID, they went in, and outside of Nasiriyah, everybody was doing thumbs up and go America to them. And that's what happened to our soldiers in Lebanon in 1982. We went into the Shiite villages in South Lebanon, and they threw rice at our boys. And, and then Amal became Hezbollah, and then, the PLO became Amal became Hezbollah, and they just chewed us up, and spit us out. And that's very similar to what that happened to U.S. forces over time in Iraq and other places. And so, we for years have been hearing, since the Cold War that ended, that high-intensity conflict, conventional warfare has ended, and now it's all low-intensity conflict and asymmetric warfare. And what you were describing in terms of Hamas as a military and obviously Hezbollah is a much larger military. They have an air force that's made up of unmanned aerial vehicles and drones, et cetera, and rockets and missiles, et cetera. But what we're really seeing here is a new form of warfare, which is, well, I don't know, new, but it is high-intensity conflict. It is military to military. It's just that the militaries are very different from one another. One is a conventional force, and one is a force that was built around a specific enemy, that the force structure is built. It's not a generic, okay, we're going to have infantry and artillery and all the rest of it. We're making up a hybrid force that's directed specifically towards annihilating Israel. So on a scale of 1 to 10, what kind of grade do you think that Israel deserves for its fighting of the war in Gaza?
At least an 8 or a 9, just by matched against the challenges. I mean, there's nobody perfect, right? So this is like the most. I also don't agree with the most moral, right? Because I served in the U.S. military. The IDF, of course, is a very moral, law-abiding, ethical force. Their performance in this war warrants 8 or a 9, as in, despite the challenges, in every metric that we talked about, they're getting the job done. They're achieving victory. They're destroying the other military. They're achieving the political goals, which is what war is about. So, despite the rhetoric.
And do you feel confident if Israel has to fight in Lebanon that we're going to be able to do it successfully?
So this is the problem with predicting wars, is that you can't hold all variables in constant. Israel, of course, can defeat Hezbollah, but that your power is not just your military force. Your power is your diplomatic, your allies, all the support that you need in order to defend yourselves. I'm confident that Israel, if the United States stays with Israel like it should, can secure its borders, yes.
All right. Well, thanks. I'm going to leave it at that. I appreciate very much your honesty and your dispassionate analysis of what's happening. I think it's extremely important for people to be listening to you. I wish that there were more people like you around who were capable of dispassionate analysis. And God bless you. I look forward to meeting you in person next time you're back in Israel. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take care. And we'll be back here later this week with another analysis of what's going on, because things keep changing so fast. I just have to keep my mouth running. Anyway, I'll see you guys soon. And thank you again so much, Professor Spencer, for coming and joining me today.